This move immediately stakes a claim in the center, opening diagonals for the queen and bishop and allowing for rapid development towards the kingside. This move initiates the French defense, a solid and strategic opening where black aims to create a strong pawn chain and potentially counterattack on the queenside after white occupies the center. This move establishes central pawn control, preparing to contest the d5 square and develop a strong pawn chain, characteristic of a queen's pawn game structure. This move defines the French defense, immediately challenging white's central pawn and preparing to unbalance the pawn structure. This move develops a knight to its most natural square, reinforcing the central pawn and preparing for further development, a standard approach in the French defense. This move, nf6, develops a piece and attacks white's central pawn, preparing to challenge for control of the d4 square and solidify black's position within this variation of the French defense. This move, a hallmark of the classical variation of the French defense, aims to immediately challenge black's knight and potentially disrupt their pawn structure or force concessions. This move consolidates white's central pawn control and develops a piece, aiming to exploit the e4 pawn's potential forward thrust while simultaneously challenging black's knight on f6 and preparing for castling. This move initiates the advance variation of the French defense, a sharp theoretical line where white gains space in the center and aims to restrict black's queenside play while creating attacking chances on the kingside. This move, nfd7, is a standard response in the French defense advance variation, aiming to reposition the knight to a more active square and prepare for a queenside pawn break with c5. This move simplifies the position by exchanging a developed bishop for a knight, which can open lines for white's pieces while black often aims to maintain a more solid pawn structure in the French defense. Recapturing with the queen on e7 centralizes the piece and prepares for kingside castling, while also potentially opening the d8-h4 diagonal for a later bishop sortie. This move develops the queen to a central square, preparing to castle queenside and connect the rooks while also supporting the advance of the e-pawn. This move safely tucks the king away, a standard defensive maneuver in many openings, particularly the French defense's advance variation where early king safety is paramount. This move, f4, aims to solidify white's central pawn control and prepare for a kingside pawn storm, typical of many variations in the French defense after white has committed to e5. This move immediately challenges white's central pawn structure, aiming to open lines and create counterplay against white's king. This knight move develops a piece, prepares for kingside castling, and supports the central pawn push, reinforcing white's intention to gain space and control. This move develops a piece to a central square, challenging white's control and preparing to support the pawn break in the center. This move resolves immediate tension in the center, exchanging a central pawn for a knight to open the d-file and potentially allow for queenside development. This move recaptures the pawn and opens the c-file, creating counterplay and challenging white's central control. Developing the bishop to an active diagonal clears the way for castling and prepares to defend the kingside pawn structure. This move initiates a pawn lever to challenge white's central control and open lines for black's pieces. This pawn capture opens the f-file, which will become a critical avenue for white's rook or queen to attack black's king in the upcoming middle game, especially after black's king has castled. This recapture repositions the queen to a more active central square, contesting the d4 pawn and preparing to rejoin the fight in the center and kingside. This move prepares to develop the kingside pieces, especially the kingside knight, to their natural squares and supports the eventual advance of the f-pawn or g-pawn to further solidify the pawn chain. Developing the bishop to d7 prepares to connect the rooks and provides a passive defense for the kingside pawns while also aiming towards the center. This move completes white's kingside development, bringing the king to safety and preparing for potential pawn breaks or piece maneuvers in the center and queenside. Black exchanges a bishop for a knight, simplifying the position and opening the d-file for potential pressure on white's queenside. This recapture opens the c-file for your rook and clears the d3 square for potential piece development, aiming for central control and attacking opportunities. The move b8 is a defensive maneuver to protect the pawn on d5 and prepare for potential knight transfers to the kingside. This move develops the final piece and prepares to contest the central files, aiming to activate the rook on the king's file for future kingside play or central pressure. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to potentially contest the long diagonal or support a kingside pawn advance. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, targeting the pawn on c7 and preparing to contest control of the queenside. This move challenges white's central control, aiming to open lines for black's pieces and potentially create an isolated d-pawn for white after exchanges. The knight redeploys to c3, preparing to potentially attack the d5 pawn or support a future d4 pawn push to open the position. This pawn sacrifice is an attempt to open lines for your pieces and gain central space, aiming to disrupt white's well-positioned knight on b5 and create counterplay on the queenside. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to control central squares and potentially support a kingside attack or transition to queenside play. This capture on e4 removes a key defender and opens lines for your pieces, though it does grant white a central pawn majority and activity for their rook. This exchange sacrifices the bishop for positional advantage, opening the e-file and targeting black's weakened kingside after the pawn capture on d4. This move recaptures the pawn and opens the e-file for black's rook, creating immediate attacking chances against white's king while simplifying the position after the pawn exchange. This move activates the rook to the open f-file, contesting control and preparing to double rooks or support an f-pawn advance for kingside initiative. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, supporting the central pawns and potentially preparing for future piece development or pawn advances. The rook's aggressive advance to e1 activates it on an open file and prepares for potential pressure against black's king or pawn structure, while also supporting the pawn on e5. The recapture on f4 with the rook opens the f-file and challenges white's control, aiming to disrupt their central pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances on the king's flank. Capturing the rook on f4 is a good choice as it removes a strong attacking piece and centralizes the queen for potential queenside play or defense of the king. This queen exchange simplifies the position, and black's choice to capture with the queen maintains central tension while preparing to challenge white's central pawn majority. This move resolves the pawn tension and opens the g-file, potentially creating an outpost for white's rook and initiating a favorable pawn structure with active pieces. The king's move to f8 prepares to connect the rooks and centralize the monarch in the endgame, aiming to escape the potential dangers on the open files and diagonals. With the queens off the board, white aims to consolidate this simplified endgame by centralizing the rook and preparing to contest the d-file, potentially creating pressure on black's central pawns. This move aims to centralize the rook, preparing to contest the open e-file and support the pawn advance on the kingside. This move aims to activate the king, preparing to participate in the endgame and potentially support pawn advances on the kingside. This move prevents white from potentially creating harmful pawn breaks on g4 or h4 and also prepares to bolster the kingside defense, creating a more solid defensive structure. This knight move centralizes the piece, attacks the weak pawn on d4, and prepares to contest the important e5 square. This exchange simplifies the position, eliminating a mobile knight for white and leading to an endgame where black must be mindful of the weakened kingside pawn structure. This pawn capture opens a file and creates an isolated pawn on the e-file, which will become a key strategic element to control or attack. The black king is actively repositioning to a safer square, preparing to participate in the endgame by heading towards the center. The king now ventures from its safe harbor, preparing to participate actively in the endgame by challenging the opponent's king and controlling central squares. The move seeks to activate the rook by bringing it to the open d-file, aiming to contest control and potentially create threats against white's king or pawns. The rook maneuvers to g4, preparing to advance to g7 and attack the f6 pawn, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure and create mating threats. This pawn push weakens the kingside pawn structure, creating potential targets for white's rooks and king to exploit in the long run. This pawn push aims to exploit the weakened kingside structure and create an open file for the rook, while potentially disrupting black's defensive setup. This move aims to centralize the king to defend the kingside pawns and potentially support a kingside advance, though it also exposes the king to potential checks along the open files. This capture opens the h-file for potential kingside activity and forces black to confront the pawn structure imbalance created by the doubled pawns. This pawn push, by capturing the g-pawn, opens the h-file for white's rook and aims to create further attacking chances against black's king. The king is stepping out to centralize and contest key squares, aiming to support the advance of the queenside pawns and potentially activate on the kingside if black's pawn structure allows. The king is now actively participating in the game, aiming to support the passed pawn while simultaneously creating opportunities for counterplay by threatening the white king. This move repositions the rook to the kingside where it can support the advance of the g-pawn and potentially pressure black's king if it becomes exposed. The move kh4 initiates a dangerous king hunt, steering the black king into open territory where it can be targeted by white's remaining pieces. Despite the apparent safety, this pawn advance creates a protected passed pawn on e6, aiming to disrupt black's coordination and potentially create a mating threat or win material. This move seeks to create a passed pawn on the queenside by pushing the g-pawn, aiming to generate counterplay and disrupt white's king's safety. This move creates an unstoppable passed pawn, forcing black to dedicate all remaining forces to its eventual capture, which will prove impossible given white's king position.